The heat in Montana was not a mere weather condition. It was a physical weight, a suffocating invisible blanket woven from dust salt and ancient, unyielding despair. It was the summer of 1885, a year when the heavens seemed to have turned their back on the frontier, leaving the land to be slowly consumed by a sun that knew no mercy. The grass, once a sea of vibrant green that danced with the western wind, had long since surrendered, turning into brittle golden needles that shattered like fine glass under the weight of even the smallest passing shadow. In the territory of Bitter Creek, you didn't just breathe the air. You swallowed the dry history of every failed dream. Silas Thorne rode through this wasteland like a ghost that the devil himself had grown tired of carrying. He was a man made of sharp angles, long shadows, and a silence that felt heavier than the cold iron strapped to his hip. At 35 years old, Silas carried the psychological weight of a century. His face was a map of every hard mile he had covered from the gambling dens of Abilene to the blood-soaked streets of Cheyenne. There was a jagged silver scar that ran along his jawline, a permanent souvenir from a night in Kansas he preferred to keep buried in the dark recesses of his mind. His skin was the texture of old weathered saddle leather, cured by years of sun wind and the relentless grit of the trail. He didn't look at the mountains or the sky. He kept his gaze fixed on the dust of the trail, watching the way it swirled around his horse's hooves. His horse, a massive black stallion named Midnight, was as weary as its master. Its coat was caked in white salt from dried sweat, looking like frost in the middle of a furnace. Silas had forgotten what it felt like to have a roof over his head that stayed in one place. His world was a series of temporary camps and transient faces, a life defined by the distance between himself and the men who wanted him dead. He was a man who had mastered the art of survival, but in doing so, he had forgotten how to live. Every beat of his heart felt like a drum in an empty room, echoing with the names of the people he had lost and the places he could never return to. The dust here had a taste, a metallic alkaline tang that coated the tongue and burned the back of the throat. It was the taste of a dying frontier, of a world where the strong ate the weak and the land ate everyone. Silas adjusted his hat, the brim shielding eyes that were the color of a winter lake just before it freezes. He wasn't looking for redemption. He was simply looking for a horizon that didn't smell like gunpowder. He had spent his youth chasing shadows, and his maturity being chased by them. Now, in the midday heat of a Montana summer, he was just a tired man on a tired horse, moving toward a destination that didn't exist. She was a tiny, defiant speck against the monumental emptiness of the Montana plains. Clara Vance stood in the very center of the road, her dress a faded indigo that had long since lost its battle with the sun. She looked as fragile as a desert flower, but as unyielding as the granite peaks in the distance. She had spent the last month watching the horizon, watching the slow decay of her father's dream, and watching the vultures, both winged and human, circling the Broken Spur Ranch. When Thomas Vance died, he left her with more than just a grieving heart. He left her with a debt she couldn't pay, and a property that Elias Sterling was determined to seize by any means necessary. "You're standing in the middle of a dead man's trail, lady," Silas said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, like a heavy shovel hitting dry, sun-baked earth. He didn't look at her face immediately. He measured her with his eyes, looking for a hidden weapon or the glint of a rifle barrel in the sagebrush behind her. He had lived this long because he never assumed a person was alone, even in the middle of nowhere. "The sun is high enough to boil the blood in your veins. Unless you're looking for a quick way to join your kin in the graveyard behind that ridge, I'd suggest you find some shade. This isn't a place for standing still." Clara didn't move an inch. Her gaze was locked onto his unblinking. "The shade is for people who have a home to go back to, Mr. Thorne," she replied. Her voice was surprisingly steady, though it carried the thinness of someone who hadn't eaten a full meal in weeks. "I am Clara Vance. My father was Thomas Vance. He spent 20 years pouring his sweat into this dirt, only to have the bank and Elias Sterling circle it like coyotes before his body was even cold. I'm not here looking for shade. I'm here because you are the only man in 3 territories who doesn't fear the dark, and I happen to be living in the longest shadow Montana has ever seen." Silas narrowed his eyes, the gray iris sharpening like a whetted blade. He recognized that look. It was the haunted, hollowed-out look of a soldier who had run out of powder and lead, but still refused to surrender the fort. It was a look he had seen in his own mirror, in the middle of 100 sleepless nights. A flicker of something that might have been respect crossed his rugged features before vanishing back into the ice. "I have a proposal for you, Silas Thorne," Clara continued, stepping a half-pace closer, the dust swirling around her ankles. "Marry me. Give me your name so I can nail it to my front gate like a warning sign. Sterling won't touch a woman protected by the Reaper. In exchange, half this ranch is yours. You want a place to stop running? This is it. This is the end of the road. No one looks for a ghost on a dying ranch in Bitter Creek." The words hung in the hot air between them, vibrating with the weight of a desperate pact. Silas looked at the house on the hill, a skeleton of a ranch bleaching in the sun, and then back at the woman. He was tired, bone-tired. The prospect of a roof that didn't move and a silence that didn't demand a trigger was more than he had ever allowed himself to hope for. With a slow, deliberate grace, he swung his leg over the saddle and dismounted. When his boots hit the ground, the dust puffed up around them, a small cloud of surrender. "I don't have a suit for a wedding, Miss Vance," Silas said, his voice rough. "And my vows usually come with a lead deposit. You sure you want a wolf guarding your hen house? Once I step across that threshold, there's no taking it back. My name brings the dark with it." Clara looked him dead in the eye. "I've been living in the dark so long, Mr. Thorne, that I've forgotten what the light looks like. I'm not asking for a saint. I'm asking for a man who knows how to survive. Take the horse. The barn is over that ridge. I'll meet you at the porch." Silas watched her turn and walk back toward the house. He took the reins of Midnight and began to walk beside her. They didn't touch, and they didn't speak. The only sound was the rhythmic clinking of his spurs and the dry rustle of her dress. The Reaper was no longer a ghost wandering the wasteland. He was a man going home. Bitter Creek was a town that lived up to its name. It was a place of hard edges and closed doors, where the wind always seemed to blow against you, and the water tasted like the copper of an old penny. It was a community built on the backs of tired men and the prayers of desperate women. And it didn't take kindly to strangers, especially strangers, who carried a reputation for harvesting souls. As Silas and Clara moved through the main street, the air grew heavy, as if the town itself were holding its breath, waiting for a storm that hadn't yet broken. The rhythmic clink of Silas's spurs against the wooden planks sounded like a ticking clock in the silence. People pulled their children closer to their skirts, and men adjusted the hats over their eyes, looking everywhere but at the man they called the Reaper. The church at the end of the road was a small, fragile thing, its white paint long since surrendered to the Montana grit. It stood like a lonely sentinel against the encroaching wilderness, a place where the law of God tried and often failed to hold back the law of the gun. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old beeswax, damp timber, and the lingering echoes of 1,000 desperate pleas. Reverend Miller, a man whose hands shook with the weight of 70 years and a lifetime of witnessing the frontier's cruelty, stood at the altar. His eyes widened as the shadow of Silas Thorne fell across the threshold, darkening the room more than the setting sun ever could. The ceremony was not a celebration. It was a transaction. There were no flowers, no music, and no smiling kin to witness the union. The only witnesses were the ghosts that followed Silas and the debt that haunted Clara. Silas felt the scratchy, uncomfortable wool of Thomas Vance's Sunday coat against his skin. A garment designed for a man of peace, now worn by a man of war. It was a disguise that fooled no one. When Clara placed her hand in his, Silas felt the coldness of her fingers, but he also felt the iron beneath the skin. She didn't look at him with the warmth of a bride. She looked at the cross behind the altar with the grim determination of a soldier committing to a suicide mission. "Do you, Clara Vance, take this man?" The Reverend began, his voice trembling like a leaf in a gale. He didn't finish the sentence with the usual grace. He spoke the words as if he were reading a death warrant. Clara didn't hesitate. Her "I do" was a sharp, clear note that cut through the stuffy air of the church. When it was Silas's turn, he didn't speak immediately. He looked at his hand, large, scarred, and stained by the things he had done, holding the delicate, trembling fingers of a woman who was gambling her soul on his shadow. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt, a ghost of a feeling he thought he had buried in Kansas. Then, with a voice that sounded like grinding stone, he gave his consent. The pact was sealed not with a kiss, but with the heavy metallic click of Silas's revolver as he adjusted his belt after the ceremony. They walked out of the church as husband and wife, but as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, they looked less like a couple and more like two survivors standing on the deck of a sinking ship. The townspeople were gone, now retreated into the safety of their homes, leaving Silas and Clara alone in the gathering dark. They didn't speak as Silas helped her onto the horse, his hands lingering for a fraction of a second on her waist, sensing the tension in her body. The ride back to the Broken Spur was a journey through a world of shadows, where every rustle of the sagebrush felt like a threat, and every breath was a reminder of the contract they had just signed in the sight of God. The first night in the Broken Spur was quieter than any graveyard Silas had ever visited. The house, a structure built for family, and warmth now felt like a hollow shell, echoing with the absence of the life that had once filled it. Every groan of the floorboards felt like a judgment, and every sigh of the wind felt like a warning. Silas sat in the kitchen, the smell of gun oil and old wood filling his senses. He worked on his Colt .45, not because it was dirty, but because the mechanical movement gave his hands something to do, something to keep them from trembling with the unfamiliarity of being settled. For 20 years, his home had been a saddle and a bedroll. Now he was surrounded by 4 walls and a roof, and the weight of the stillness was almost unbearable. He could hear her in the other room, the soft rustle of her dress, the light thud of her shoes hitting the floor, the long, shaky breath she took before blowing out her candle. Between them stood only a few inches of weathered pine, a barrier that felt as thick as a mountain range. Silas thought about the woman on the other side of that wall. He thought about the courage it took to invite a monster into her home to fight other monsters. He wondered if she lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made a deal with a devil that would eventually consume her. He wanted to tell her she was safe, that his word was as solid as the iron in his hand, but the words felt clumsy and alien in his mouth. In his world, words were for lying or for dying. They weren't for comfort. In the silence, the ghosts of Silas's past began to stir. The faces of the men he had killed, the smell of black powder, the taste of blood in the back of his throat. They all came rushing back, emboldened by the stillness of the ranch. He looked at the empty chair across from him, where Thomas Vance had once sat, and felt like an interloper, a thief who had stolen a dead man's life. He wasn't a farmer. He didn't know how to make things grow. He only knew how to make things stop. He looked at his hands and saw the blood that no amount of soap or time could ever truly wash away. He was a man defined by his scars, and here he was in a house that smelled of cinnamon and grief, trying to pretend he belonged. Clara, on the other side of the partition, watched the moon climb higher in the sky. She didn't feel like a bride. She felt like a general who had just recruited a mercenary she couldn't control. The presence of Silas Thorne in her house was a physical pressure, a low-frequency hum that vibrated in her very bones. She could hear the rhythmic click-slide-click of his gun from the kitchen, a sound that should have terrified her, but instead provided a strange, dark comfort. It was the sound of protection. It was the sound of a wall that Elias Sterling wouldn't be able to climb. She touched the cold glass of the window and whispered a prayer to a father who couldn't hear her asking for the strength to survive the savior she had chosen. As the candle finally guttered out and the house was plunged into total darkness, Silas finally put his gun back into its holster. He didn't go to bed. He stayed in the chair, his eyes fixed on the door, watching the shadows move as the moon crossed the sky. He was a watchdog now, a sentinel for a woman he barely knew on a ranch that was slowly turning to dust. He was no longer running, but as he listened to the steady rhythmic breathing of Clara in the next room, he realized that staying might be the hardest thing he had ever done. The contract was signed. The vows were spoken, and the Reaper had finally found a place to rest. But in the West, rest was just another word for waiting for the next fight. The first week of their marriage was defined by a new kind of silence. It wasn't the hostile, jagged silence of the trail, nor was it the fearful stillness of the town. It was the silence of two people who had decided to let their hands do the talking. Silas didn't know how to be a husband, and he certainly didn't know how to be a farmer, but he knew how to fix things. He understood the logic of wood and iron, the way a fence post had to be buried deep to withstand the mountain winds, and the way a rusted hinge needed oil to find its voice again. He spent his days from dawn until dusk reclaiming the broken spur from the wilderness, one post at a time. Clara watched him from the shadows of the porch. She saw the way he worked, not with the joyful energy of a young man building a future, but with the grim, tireless persistence of a man paying a debt. He didn't complain about the heat that blistered his shoulders, nor did he ask for help. He moved with a mechanical grace, his body a well-oiled machine of bone and muscle. Every time the hammer fell, it felt like he was driving a stake through his own past, trying to bury the Reaper beneath the dirt of the ranch. Clara didn't offer him words of encouragement. She knew they would be wasted on a man like Silas. Instead, she offered him cold water and the sight of a home that was no longer falling apart. There was a strange intimacy in their shared labor. Silas would come in at noon, the scent of pine and sweat clinging to him like a second skin. He would wash his hands at the basin, the water turning a muddy red, and Clara would place a plate of food before him without a word. They would sit across from each other, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the distant lowing of a neighbor's thirsty cattle. Silas never looked at her directly, but he was acutely aware of her presence, the way she moved with a quiet efficiency, the way her hair caught the afternoon light, and the way she seemed to be slowly reclaiming her own soul as the ranch regained its strength. They were two broken instruments, learning to play a harmony in the quiet. Labor was their bridge. For Silas, every repaired board on the porch was an apology for a life spent breaking things. For Clara, every mended shirt and every warm meal was a silent vow of loyalty. They didn't speak of the Sunday that was fast approaching, nor did they speak of Elias Sterling and the threat that hung over them like a low-hanging cloud. In the rhythm of the work, they found a temporary sanctuary, a place where the reaper and the widow could simply be a man and a woman trying to survive the winter. One evening, as the shadows stretched long across the kitchen floor, Silas placed a small object on the table. It was a bird carved from a piece of scrap cedar he had saved from the fence posts. It was rough-hewn, the marks of his pocket knife still visible, but it held a delicate grace that seemed impossible for hands as violent as his. He pushed it toward her without a word. Clara picked it up, her fingers tracing the smooth grain of the wood. She looked at him, then really looked at him, and for the first time she didn't see a shield. She saw a man who was desperately trying to remember how to create something beautiful. The air in the room changed in that moment. The walls of the broken spur, which had witnessed so much grief, seemed to exhale. The language of labor had finally given way to something softer, something that didn't have a name yet, but felt remarkably like hope. They were no longer just two strangers bound by a contract. They were two souls beginning to weave a life out of the dust. As the first stars appeared over the Montana plains, the ranch felt less like a fortress and more like a home. The Sunday was coming, and with it the blood and the fire. But for now, in the flickering light of the lamp, they were enough. Peace in the West is never a permanent state. It is merely a long breath taken between two storms. For 2 weeks, the broken spur had existed in a pocket of stolen time, a sanctuary where the smell of fresh timber and wood smoke had replaced the bitter tang of alkaline dust and fear. But as the moon rose high over the jagged peaks of the mountains, the wind changed. It brought with it the scent of wet leather, expensive tobacco, and the unmistakable vibration of men who didn't ride for pleasure. Silas Thorne felt it before he heard it. He was sitting on the porch, the carved cedar bird resting in his pocket, watching the way the shadows played across the yard. His body, which had begun to forget the constant tension of the trail, snapped back into an old lethal focus. The farmer vanished, and the reaper returned to his post. He didn't need to see the riders to know who they were. Elias Sterling didn't move in silence. He moved with the arrogance of a man who owned the dirt beneath his feet and the souls of the people who walked on it. As the 5 silhouettes crested the ridge, their torches flickering like angry orange eyes against the blue-black sky. Silas stood up. He didn't reach for his gun, not yet, but he stepped into the center of the porch, his massive frame blocking the light from the window. Inside, he heard the floorboards groan as Clara moved toward the door. He didn't turn around. He didn't have to. The air between them was already thick with the understanding that the honeymoon of their labor was over. The wolves had finally grown tired of waiting at the perimeter. Sterling rode a pale horse, a ghost of an animal that matched the coldness of his intentions. He pulled the reins 10 yards from the porch, his men fan out behind him like a dark cloak. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the snorting of the horses and the dry rattle of the wind through the eaves. Sterling looked at the repaired fence, the mended porch, and finally at the man standing in his way. He didn't see a husband or a rancher. He saw an obstacle that needed to be cleared. I heard a rumor that Thomas Vance's girl found herself a stray dog to guard her porch. Sterling said, his voice smooth and sharp as a silk cord. But I didn't realize she'd gone and found the most famous mongrel in the territory. You're a long way from Abilene Thorne, And you're standing on property that's about to undergo a change in ownership. Silas didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch until it became an insult, a cold void that Sterling's arrogance couldn't fill. He looked at each of the men behind Sterling, marking them with a predator's eye. He saw the way they shifted in their saddles, the way their hands hovered near their holsters. They were hired guns, men who lived for $1 and died for nothing. They knew who he was. They had heard the stories of the man who doesn't miss, and despite the numbers being on their side, fear was a cold sweat on their brows. Silas took a slow breath, the smell of the torch's kerosene and burning pine filling his lungs. It was a familiar smell, the smell of an impending storm. "The ownership isn't changing, Sterling," Silas said, his voice low and vibrating with a terrifying calm. "Unless you've got a deed signed by the lady of the house and a god who's willing to look the other way, I suggest you turn those horses around. The road back to Bitter Creek is a lot shorter than the one that leads to a shallow grave on this ranch." Silas stepped down from the porch, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy final thud. He stood in the yard, a lone man against 5, but he didn't look outnumbered. He looked like the reckoning they had all been trying to avoid. Sterling laughed, a dry, hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You think a name and a fast draw are enough to stop progress? This valley is drying up, Thorne. The water under this dirt is worth more than every life on this ranch combined. I've got the law in my pocket and a dozen more men waiting in town. You're a ghost, Silas, a relic of a dying age. Why die for a woman you barely know and a ranch that's already half dead?" Sterling leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Pack your horse and ride. I'll give you 500 gold eagles to disappear. That's more than your soul has ever been worth." Silas didn't blink. He felt the weight of the carved bird in his pocket, a reminder of the quiet home he had begun to build. He thought of Clara standing behind the glass, her survival tied to his shadow. He realized then that he wasn't fighting for the land, or even for the name he had given her. He was fighting for the silence he had found in her kitchen, for the way the first stars looked over a mended fence. He reached for his holster, his fingers brushing the cold steel. "The gold is no good to me, Sterling. I've already found what I was looking for. Now get off my land before I forget that I'm a married man and start acting like the one you're so afraid of." The tension in the air was a taut wire, ready to snap. Sterling's men drew their breath in unison, their horses dancing nervously under the pressure of the moment. Sterling stared at Silas, searching for a crack in the ice, a hint of hesitation. He found none. With a frustrated growl, he yanked his horse's head around. "Sunday, Thorne." Sterling spat the torchlight, reflecting the venom in his gaze. "When the sun goes down on Sunday, the bank signs the papers. We'll be back then, and we won't be coming to talk. If you're still here, you'll be part of the ashes." As the riders turned and galloped back into the dark, Silas stood alone in the yard, the dust settling around his boots like a shroud. The shadows had finally come for them, and the Reaper knew that the time for hammers and wood was over. The time for lead was here. Sunday didn't arrive with a whisper. It arrived with the stench of inevitable violence. The air in the valley was thick, so heavy with the coming storm, that every breath felt like drinking from a stagnant well. Silas Thorne didn't wait on the porch this time. He stood in the dirt, the very earth he had bled into for 2 weeks, claiming it with every inch of his massive frame. When the thunder finally rolled across the peaks, it wasn't a warning from the heavens. It was the sound of 12 horses galloping toward the end of a dream. Elias Sterling didn't come to talk. He came with torches and the black-hearted intent to burn the broken spur into a memory. The confrontation was short, sharp, and brutal, Not a cinematic duel, but a desperate struggle for survival. Silas didn't move like a hero. He moved like a force of nature that had been contained for too long. Each shot from his Colt 45 was a final period at the end of a long, dark sentence. But even a legend bleeds. When the dust finally settled, and the last of Sterling's men had retreated into the shadows of the valley, Silas remained standing, but the iron in his spine had finally begun to buckle. He felt the hot, sticky bloom of red spreading across his side, a silent price for the peace he had bought. Clara was down the stairs before the last echo of gunfire faded. She found him slumped against the very porch railing. He had mended his breath, coming in ragged, wet gasps. The Reaper was gone. In his place was just a man, broken and shivering under the weight of a lifetime of sins. She didn't scream, and she didn't cry. With the same iron resolve she had shown on the trail, she pulled his heavy arm over her shoulder and guided him inside into the sanctuary of the home they had built, out of dust and silence. The West eventually changed, as all things do. The age of the gunfighter faded into the age of the plow, and the name Silas Thorne became a legend whispered only by the oldest men in the saloons of Bitter Creek. But on the broken spur, the name meant something else entirely. It meant a father who could fix anything with his hands. It meant a husband who stood as a shadow between his family and the world's cruelty. It meant a legacy built not on the bodies of the fallen, but on the strength of a woman who dared to ask for a devil's hand and found a man's soul instead. The drought eventually broke, and the rain that fell on the Montana plains washed away the blood and the sod salt, leaving only the rich, fertile earth. Silas and Clara didn't talk much about the past. They didn't have to. The scars on Silas's back and the lines on Clara's face told the story of their survival better than any words ever could. They had made a deal in the dust, signed it with lead, and sealed it with a love that was as hard and enduring as the mountains themselves. As the stars began to twinkle over the valley, the Reaper finally laid down his scythe, and for the first time in a century, the frontier was quiet.